God damn, Eddie.
We were fighting over the street.
It's like when you're trying to open a door and you unlock it at the same time as you click, and you're not even opening. Classic movie scene. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Cadre Formation School, hosted by Midwestern Marks. Today, we're going to be discussing Engels' letters on historical materialism from the early 1890s. And we felt like this would be a good reading, specifically after engaging last time with the preface to Marx's 1859, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, where the base and superstructure spatial metaphor is brought up. It's a very misunderstood metaphor. It's one that critics of Marxism especially use in order to claim that Marxism is fatalistic, deterministic, linear, etc., etc. And these letters disprove a lot of those myths quite explicitly. So I'm happy to have along with me today, as usual, my comrade, my brother in arms, Eddie Liger-Smith, my comrade and brother in arms as well, Noah Krashvik, and a new face to the Midwestern Marks YouTube, comrade Paul So.
Hey.
So as we did last time, I think it would be worthy for us to go around and give some comments on what your initial thoughts on the reading was, and then we can dig deeper into the discussion and the content of the letters. But I guess we can start clockwise. Noah, you can say your comments, and then Paul, Eddie, and then myself at the end.
Sure. Hey, everybody. Good evening. I want to preface this by saying it's late for me as an old man, so things may get weird. Anyway, also, Paul is a very good friend and a brilliant writer for us.
Yes.
And I personally have learned a lot from him, so I'm really, really excited to have him here tonight. Regarding these letters, they're not something people bring up a lot. And I think they should be, especially these days, because one, anytime someone throws that sort of economic determinism, class reductionism argument around, Engels answers that very directly in one of these, in the one to Bloch, right? Am I pronouncing that right? Bloch? I don't know, whatever. But the main feature of the whole set is not just coming out and saying historical materialism is A, B, and C, right? It's explaining why it's correct, which is so important. And at the same time, this explains it to you, right? And so one of the things people often get wrong, and I think this is the main focus of all four letters, is that they believe society or whatever is moved solely by ideas in a vacuum and individual wills, or that it must be determined only politically and that individual wills, or economically, and that individual wills don't matter. What Engels proves instead is that economic element, the sort of mode of production, creates us, all individuals, and the ideas we have. We make history ourselves as people, but not in a vacuum and not as individuals. We are created by things. We have certain problems we must address, that kind of thing. I'm sorry I rambled there. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul. I'm a writer from Midwestern Marks. I'm in the PhD program at Santa Barbara. I'm a PhD candidate in writing my dissertation on sort of the intersection between normative ethics and Marxism. That's basically what I work on. I want to thank Carlos for inviting me here. I appreciate it. Carlos asked me to read these four letters just an hour before the live stream started. To be quite frank, I didn't read all of them, but I read like at least two of them, and I sort of like read bits of the third. I think it was the third or second one, but either way. I basically agree with Noah completely. These letters and Carlos, these letters just prove this very common myth that that Marxism or historical materialism in particular is just economic determinism. And one thing I noticed when reading these letters is how dialectical it is, right? There's sort of this dialectical relationship between the material base, the mode of production, and the superstructure, or what people call the superstructure, the political institutions, the culture, religion, philosophy, and so on and so forth. Engel sort of lays down or briefly describes the complex interaction between the two. What makes historical materialism materialist is that the mode of production, that which produces the means of life at the very least, ultimately plays a decisive role in how things develop. And furthermore, Engels does say, at least in one of the letters, I forgot which one it was, but he does say explicitly that men make history, or just people make history, right? But they don't make history under, out of sheer will. They make history under specific circumstances. So he's not, he's not determinist in the pejorative sense that he denies agency. Historical materialism presupposes agency, in fact, right? If you read the thesis of Feuerbach, Marx emphasizes that history is based on the activity, the sensuous, concrete activity of human beings, right? And this activity being labor, right? Labor is basically the material basis for history, right? And also on top of that, you have class struggle between the laborers and the exploiters. So basically, historical materialism is not economically deterministic. It emphasizes on human agency, but human agency that's circumscribed by the mode of production that we inherit from our predecessors, right? And there's a very important, significant place for culture, for politics, for the state, institutions, et cetera, et cetera. I also think that Engels may not have said this, but if you read the letters a little bit carefully, there's more than a lot of room to sort of argue against the accusation that Marxism is class reductionist, right? Because as based on what Engels wrote, the sort of the ideological, the ideology, the culture, and so forth, those play a significant role, right? Under capitalism, they do shape sort of the trajectory and the direction, right? Even though in the final analysis, how the mode of production develops plays a decisive role. So that's pretty. I mean, one last thing. One thing that was really interesting is that Engels, in the first letter, he mentions, he sort of like unintentionally foreshadows like the financial oligarchs, the investors. He talks about how the investors, they own the railroads, they own this and that. He talks about how it's not the old-fashioned industrial capitalists who own things. Now you have the investors, right? And he's talking about them in their sort of embryonic form, right? And obviously, when Lenin comes along, the financial oligarchs have matured, right? They have ascended to the high strata of the bourgeoisie. But what's interesting is that Engels noticed the investor strata, right, of the capitalist class, of the bourgeoisie. And so I thought that was worth mentioning. Engels basically, like, maybe if not consciously, he basically like noticed that there's something new that's developing. It's imperialism, right, that's developing. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say about these letters.
I have that quote ready if you want to hear it before you go, Eddie. If not, we can get to it later. He says, "We make our own history, but under very definite presuppositions and conditions. Among these are the economic, which are finally decisive. But there are also the political, etc. Yes, even the ghostly traditions, which haunt the minds of men, play a role, though not a decisive one."
Right. And that's almost right out of the 18th Brumaire. Eddie, your introductory comments?
Yeah, Carlos and I got the time zones a little mixed up. So I finished in between Engels' letter to Hans Starkenberg. So I'm like 2/3 of the way through. But yeah, these letters are really useful, which something that I really like about Marx and Engels' letters, either to each other or other people, is a lot of times they're answering concrete problems about, the politics and economics of their day, and answering practical questions. And here, Engels is just responding to people who are asking some of the most frequently asked questions about Marxism. And he's answering those people directly. So reading these letters can be really, really useful. I noticed that Engels uses the word reciprocity a bunch of times, meaning exchange between two things, which is, a lot of people think of Marxism as deterministic. Production and reproduction determines absolutely everything, absolutely. When in reality, you have these things like exchange markets and money markets and legal structures, which, based on the division of labor, become sort of their own independent thing, which can then act upon production, and they act reciprocally. So these sort of elements of the superstructure act upon each other, and they act upon production, and production acts upon them. But production's always the base. Production is the basis that allows these things to come about in the first place, that allows this division of labor to come about. And another word that he uses a lot, that Carlos uses a lot, is condition or conditioning. So again, meaning production doesn't absolutely determine these elements in the superstructure, it conditions it. And these elements in the superstructure condition production. And I agree with Paul that you could read this as a rejection or a debunk of the idea that Marxism is class reductionist. And one of the questions, even I remember, was asking about how economic relations are causally effective, and then what roles do the factors of race play historically. So a question specifically about race, and Engels has his answer. And I was thinking too, you have racism in like the American South, which comes about because the economic system is slave labor or plantation labor, and slave labor. But then, because racism was so prevalent, you had a lot of poor white workers who sided with the Confederacy, which was the political expression of the enslaving oligarchic class, even though the poor white workers had nothing in common with that class. And that you could consider racism then coming back to affect production. And they were fighting for the maintenance of the mode of production that was slavery in the Civil War. So yeah, that was my first impression. And also, as Paul said, super dialectical. I mean, that's kind of a staple of Engels. He's always, sounds very Hegelian in everything he writes. And at one point he says, all these men are lacking is dialectics. It's as if Hegel doesn't exist for them. So stressing the importance of Hegel for all of us, which, is, again, common theme in all of Engels' work.
Reminds me of the one quote from Lenin where he talks about how all the Marxists of the previous era weren't Marxists because they'd never read Hegel. And you really can't. One second.
Engels calls out pseudo-Marxists here, too. He puts Marxists in quotes who are deterministic.
Yeah, that Lenin quote is so fundamental. You cannot understand Capital, specifically the beginning, if you have not read the whole of Hegel's Science of Logic. Therefore, up to now, none of these Marxists have understood Capital, right? Which means, they haven't understood basically Marxism. And again, we see here, as you mentioned, Eddie, an emphasis on reading Hegel, and as both of you, as basically everyone has hinted, a very dialectical way of working through problems and thinking about these questions that arise because of the sort of thinking that Hegel would call the understanding. We don't use that word in the way that Hegel did anymore, but the understanding is a form of thinking that loves to separate things into binaries, right? And that's what's being done here. And that quote, what all these gentlemen lack is dialectics. For them, Hegel never existed. That's so important for the work that I do. I've been developing, as you guys know, the theory of the purity fetish, which tries to lay the ground of the political mistakes that we see in the dominant socialist left in the West, and in Western Marxism. It tries to lay the ground on the absence of dialectical thinking. And it's a quote that I'm constantly going back to in my work. One of the things that I wanted to maybe push back against was the idea that that there isn't economic determinism here. I think there is economic determinism. The problem is that the people that accuse us of economic determinism do not understand the way we understand determination. What they're referring to is economic fatalism, or in other words, as Eddie mentioned, absolute determinism. Right? The way that we understand determinism, when something is determined, is not that freedom is absent, right? As someone here brought it up in the chat, a quote that comes from Engels' Anti-Düring, freedom is insight into necessity, nothing else, right? Our understanding of freedom comes from a tradition that goes all the way back to Spinoza and comes through Hegel and then gets into Marxism, which is that necessity and freedom are not two different things set apart from each other, but that freedom is itself the awareness of necessity, right? You can't have freedom completely divorced from necessity, and you can't have necessity if it doesn't already contain within it the embryo of freedom. Again, this is about thinking about these categories that philosophy loves to separate and to keep apart, about thinking about how they interact, about realizing, as Engels notes here and as he notes in Dialectics of Nature and Anti-Düring, there's no hard and fast lines anywhere in nature. All of these opposites, they're really constantly interpenetrative and dependent on each other. And that's one of the things that you get with the relationship between the determining factor and the determined factor, which is that the determined factor isn't just passively determined. The determined factor also has relative independence. That's a specific concept, relative independence. And in that relative independence, it's capable of developing its own emergent laws. And from the interactions that exist there, it can then reciprocally go back and condition that which it is determined by, right? And that's something very interesting, because that which lays the ground for something else, right, can then be affected by that thing which it laid the ground for. And so this way of thinking about things as existing under reciprocal relations, it's so important. It removes the thinking of causality in that linear, almost Aristotelian fashion of there's cause and there's effect. It says, no, the effect is itself only capable of being effect because of the cause, and the cause is only capable of being cause because of the effect. There's a reciprocal relationship between the two, which doesn't remove the fact that one aspect in that relationship of determined and determining, it doesn't remove the fact that one aspect is predominant, that one aspect is the point of departure, or the aspect that in the last analysis is the one that sets the boundaries, the limits that condition in that form the things that it is conditioning. So I was trying to think through that, about the relationship. If we're looking at two things dialectically existing in a reciprocal relationship, the one to the other, how can there be one that is the determining one that is not the determining one, excuse me, one that is the principal one, right? One that has more emphasis. And I think that in a good category that will be introduced 40 years after this essay are the categorical sets that Mao introduces of principal versus non-principal aspects of contradictions, right? We realize that a contradiction is, in essence, when a unity of opposites exists in a thing and in a process, but there's always a principal aspect in that contradiction. And when you look at history, even if the base and the superstructure are in a relationship the one to the other, the principal aspect there is the base, the economic base, the one that sets the boundaries out of which that relative independence of the superstructure then takes place and reciprocally conditions the base.
I think that Engels goes out of his way to continually point out throughout these that there is always a principal aspect, right? There is always more emphasis on the original foundation of what shapes the entire process, right? And so to put it into terms that are not going to be anywhere near as eloquent as Carlos just did, and I want to say, by the way, at the beginning of that, he mentioned the purity fetish. And that actually ties into the mistakes we often make about this and absolutism. That absolutism is within the purity fetish. And that understanding, I can't understate how important it is going to be for 21st century American Marxism-Leninism. It's absolutely brilliant, and Carlos's work on it is brilliant. But to bring the whole thing he was just talking about into sort of a concrete example, think about it this way. As capitalism developed into imperialism in its monopoly form, right? We have our economic base, which is the beginning of the consolidation of the monopoly cartels, right? The laws that are created then come from this, right? Are a reaction to this movement within the economic base. They then affect how that economic base works, right? And sort of form what characteristics it has. And then the process happens again and again and again and again and again, right? So I just think putting it in terms like that really makes it concrete for us.
For sure. Was Paul taken out by the CIA? Paul, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm with you. Sorry, I had to.
No worries.
I had to use the restroom real quick.
Oh, gotcha. My bad.
Yeah.
Is that what the kids call it these days?
I think Engel's. I mean, he, like Noah said, he makes like the principal contradiction idea pretty clear throughout all of this, which is interesting because it's like we normally associate that with Mao, and he was the first one to maybe verbalize it or write it down and make it a concept and popularize it. But it's a thread running through all of Marx and Engels' work already. You know, Mao is just building off it and highlighting something that I think is essential. And Engels has some good ways of explaining it here. Some good ways of what's the word I'm thinking of? Good analogies for explaining how this works. Like he's talking about the division of labor and how that creates, a different sector for transportation, a different sector for finance. And while all of these have their own, independent will and conditioned production, the common thread that runs through all of them is production, or is the productive base. And then he says at the last minute, the productive relations always make themselves felt. So not completely deterministic, but, as Carlos said, still determining and still the base of everything. Without advancements in production, you wouldn't have, law firms or, investment firms or whatever, these different independent branches that are able to come about. And yeah, he also says that dialecticians see things in their connection, versus like people who have what Marx and Engels call the metaphysical worldview, separate cause and effect, and then they look at them in isolation. And I think you see that a lot with people's analysis of like the war in Ukraine, where the liberals just are able to isolate it and say, look, Russia invaded Ukraine, full stop, period. Putin, Russia, evil. Let's send all our support to Ukraine. Where if you look at things in their interconnection, of course, you see everything NATO's done in the region, the coup. You could go as far back as the NATO carpet bombing and dissolution of Yugoslavia, which now the Balkans have more NATO occupied areas or more NATO troops than any other place on earth. So if you see all these things in connection, you see how U.S. imperialism is at their root, which, the capitalist relations of production are at the root of that. So you see the thread of production running through everything, and how seeing things in their interconnection helps us understand them fully.
speaking of production, what's really interesting about the whole Ukraine scenario is how the mainstream media doesn't really talk very much about what makes Ukraine economically valuable. One thing that makes Ukraine economically valuable is it has a very rich agriculture, right? I mean, I saw like an article from the Atlantic Council talking about this, how Ukraine is a breadbasket of the world, right? And I read articles from like a progressive think tank. I think it's called Oak Institute. I forget what it's called, but they published findings pointing out that there are these holding companies that are made by like French multinational corporations, by Arab multinational corporations, by U.S. multinational corporations. They create this holding specifically to purchase, right, these hectares of agricultural land, right. So there's that, and there's also the fact that Ukraine is one of the debtors, right? The biggest debtors of the IMF. And how's that connected to agriculture? Well, probably because if Ukraine accepts the loans, which it did around 2014, then it has to slowly like privatize its assets, right? So there's that, and there's also the fact that Ukraine is one of the exporters of arms, right? And this is interesting because it's right next to Russia, right? Ukraine is the exporter of arms; is right next to Russia. So it's like if you look at the level of the production, right? Ukraine does play a very important role in the global economy of that we call imperialism, right? Ukraine is not a pawn. Ukraine is more like a knight, I guess, right? A knight that traps the Russia, whatever. So yeah, it's like, but basically, yeah, I agree with Eddie. Like, we have to look at things in their interconnection, right? We especially have to look at production, right, and what role that plays in this global capitalist economy. But yeah.
I think, especially concerning Ukraine and food production, the Great Reset, which is not a right-wing conspiracy theory, okay? I promise you, look at the WEF website. It's not. Anyway, their whole thing right now is buying up farmland, right? That's what's up with the farmers' uprisings in Dutch areas and whatever other. I'm not familiar with that part of the world, but like Norway and stuff, right? Sweden, like a lot of these places have had farmer uprisings recently because big agriculture, the cartels, are trying to gobble up all the arable land literally in the world. So this is like Ukraine is one part of this. If you remember, the Ukraine was the food source of like half the Soviet Union and communist bloc, right? It's a big deal, not to mention its geographic location for energy transportation, which I know energy is on the downswing, but it's still up there as one of the most powerful cartels, right? So speaking of interconnection, it really helps to paint this entire global picture because imperialism is a global phenomenon, right?
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that you guys are doing right now in the analysis of Ukraine is concretizing an understanding of a phenomena that's looked at abstractly. And just to repeat something that we have been saying, right, when we speak about abstract thinking, we're not saying, thinking that's just like in the clouds, as is usually thought of by common sense in the dialectical tradition. The people who think abstractly are the people that pass judgments on how things look, that look at just facts and disconnect them from the factors, right? The people that judge a book by its cover. That's the common sense saying that we have in order to talk about it. And instead of that, we have a understanding that that comes from the dialectical method, which is that in order to know a thing as best as possible, which is as concretely as possible, to know the things as a diverse unity of determinations, to know a thing comprehensively, you need to go from the abstract to concrete. You need to get more and more and more and more concrete. That's what I think you guys are doing with the analysis of Ukraine, but also that's something that we see Engel's doing here with these letters, right? Which is interesting because Engels is super, super humble. And to me, he's a genius, perhaps as genius as Marx, but he considers himself a second fiddle, right? There's that famous footnote from Ludwig Feuerbach and the Outcome of Classical German Philosophy, where he says, Marx is a genius. I'm just a smart guy, second fiddle. That's bullshit, right? Because what you see in these letters is an immense concretization of the thing that we looked at in the last Cadre Formation School, which is the analysis of the base and the superstructure, right? What he's doing here is literally concretizing the understanding that Marxism provides for society and dispelling some of the myths that arise from people that read Marx abstractly, but also from the way that Marx wrote, where he could have cleared things up a little bit more. And he's admitting at the end that because of the necessities of the time, they had to focus almost solely on economics. And to analyze the capitalist mode of production as a whole, they needed to fully focus on that. And they still didn't finish, right? Marx had like 6 books planned. He wasn't able to finish even one because he was still working on the first volume towards the end of his life. He wasn't even working on volumes 2 and 3. So it brings up the question of the analysis of culture, the analysis of the various levels of the superstructure. And it's common to say that Marxism only focuses on economics, right? It's also common to say that as a reaction to the Frankfurt School, oh, those guys only focus on culture. That's wrong. Both are mistakes, right? If you only focus on economics, you're not going to see the ways in which that which economics gives rise to, this field of the superstructure, which contains various levels, can also condition it in a reciprocal manner. But if you only focus on culture, you can't see where the hell those cultural phenomena are coming from, right? So I think that what Engels provides here is something that philosophers do when they know that they don't have the time or the energy to finish a project, which is take Marxism, take dialectical materialism into the analysis of the superstructure. Take it into the field in which Marx and myself, because of the necessities of the time, because of how long it takes to do what we did, we're not able to do because of issues of health, et cetera, et cetera. So take this analysis that we're providing into the field of culture, and here's the essence of it, right? Don't reduce one thing to the other. Do not reduce anything to another thing, but see how that thing arises out of it, but also has this sort of relative independence that's still connected to it. And I think that perhaps the best figure at doing precisely this, or the 2 best figures, would be Lenin, whose focus on politics really takes the scientific method that Marxism provides, that dialectical materialism provides, into the sphere, that specific sphere of the superstructure. And with regards to culture, just because he was in a Western European country, Gramsci, right? So Lenin and Gramsci are, to me at least, the concretizers of this project that Engels lays out here as you guys need to pick up the baton from here on and finish the analysis of the capitalist mode of life as a whole that we were not able to do because we had to focus on economics.
I would like to add something to what you said, Carlos, and I really appreciate that you basically pointed out that by the time Marx and Engels passed away, historical Marxism, in particular historical dialectical materialism, is not a complete project. It's incomplete, right? Because there's more room for concretization, right? But one of my pet peeves, or one of the things that annoys me, is people say, "Oh, but Marx didn't say anything about X, right, or Y." And like one really popular example is race. Marx barely talks about race, right? And because Marx barely talks about race, historical materialism is irrelevant to people in the periphery, right? The colonial subjects and people who are enslaved and the descendants of the enslaved, right? And let's assume that's true. I mean, I don't think that's really true because there are hints that Marx does talk about race
A lot.
here and there. Oh yeah, a lot. But you just have to do what basically you have to apply the method, right? You have to apply the method of dialectical and historical materialism on issues like racism, right? And this is something that Du Bois did, right? Du Bois wrote a book on Reconstruction, and I have yet to read the book. I only read summaries of it.
Brilliant.
But he wrote the book into Reconstruction to concretize the concrete and material situation of racism in the United States, right? He basically applied dialectical and historical materialism to racism, right, in the United States. And I'm pretty sure you could do a similar thing on like racism in Latin America, right? Racism in Africa. It's but yeah, so some people make this lazy argument that, oh yeah, Marx barely talks about race, therefore it's irrelevant. Whereas people like Du Bois, who is black by the way, just actually applied the method, right? Actually applied the method, and you have a more not a complete picture, but a more complete picture of the history of racism, right? That's now seen through the lens of historical materialism, as well in particular through the lens of class struggle, right? But that's being forgotten. Nobody talks about that. Instead, everyone just talks about not everyone, but back in 2019 or 2018, it was a 1619 project, right? People just look at like the history of races in the United States, absent or almost absent of class struggle, right? It's just whites versus black. But like we all know here that like at most around like 20 or 25% of people in the United States like probably own slaves, right? But that's not the whole group, right? It's much more complex than you had the yeoman whites, right? You had like other social classes at the time, right? But the class dynamic is missing. It's not missing. It's not being analyzed, right? Very carefully. And I think this is sort of like the symptom of modern day liberalism. And this is something I spoke with Noah on 30 or 40 minutes ago. I think modern day liberalism is class blind, right? It's not completely blind to class, but there's a sense in which it distorts class, right? It downplays class, it distorts it. It's sort of there's a parallel between commodity fetishism and how liberalism sees class. Commodity fetishism treats commodities as things as opposed to social relations, right? And liberalism just treats class not as a social relation, but something else, like an income bracket or whatever, right? So because of this, because there's a distortion of class, we don't have a proper understanding of racism, right, and white supremacy in the United States, right? And I think that's a huge problem for the modern left right now. There's no historical materialist understanding of white supremacy and racism. People implicitly or explicitly reject this picture. And I think this is detrimental to communists, right? To Marxists everywhere. And not only that, but I think it's counter-revolutionary to reject the historical materialist understanding of racism. Because Marx and Engels developed dialectical and historical materialism as a weapon for the proletariat to take down capitalism. And if you reject this weapon, that you're disarming yourself. So anyways, sorry I went on this long rant, but I really believe that we as Marxists, as communists, we need to stick to a historical material understanding of racism. And we don't have a complete picture, but that's not grounds to dismiss the historical materialism, including dialectical materialism, but it's a reason to complete it, right? And it's our job as communists, as Marxists, to complete this picture, to continue where Du Bois left off. So that's all I have to say for now. I'm sorry.
That was great, brother. I think you touched on a few really important things, that there is no historical materialist analysis in the broader left. One, the 1619 project is a bourgeois project, okay? And bourgeois institutions serve the class the class who lend them its characteristics, right? It is always going to serve the bourgeoisie, but we also have people like Henry Winston and Frank Chapman that do view this through the lens of historical materialism. And I think it's important that we learn from them. And I had something else to say and I forgot it. That happens to me so much. I really just want, so a lot of times we have this sort of fake Marxism that comes around, right? The left in general they will say, well, class, according to Marxism, is what job you have, right? If you are upper management, maybe you're bourgeois. If you are a carpenter like me, you're proletarian, etc., etc. But class is more than this. Class is a social relation, right? That takes on concrete forms within communities, and it's an ongoing relation, just like Engels talks about in these letters, of one creating the form of the other, which then affects the first one, right? So class creates our community, and then our community changes how that class works. So it goes on over time, always with the economic factor in the like determining role. And that book right there is absolutely brilliant. My party club read it a while ago for our book club, and it tears to shreds all of the faux radicalism going around today. It tears Cedric Robinson to shreds, who wrote Black Marxism, within like the first section, where he basically says like, it's not Marxism. None of what he's saying is Marxism, which is true.
Yeah, I mean, Engels here, and I mean, Marx does at other points. He's talking about the importance of going to the concrete, but he also talks about the importance of abstraction, and the importance of theory. And when people kind of divorce the historical materialist method from analyzing, America or things like racism in America, I think they're forgetting that method is important, and there's a reason that we use that method. And I found that when I was doing research for a piece I did about how slavery in the American South was influential for the development of Northern capitalism in the American North, and capitalism in Europe. And what Edward Baptiste in his book about slavery did was basically just analyze the economics of it. He would finish every chapter with like a story about how the slaves would build community and find ways to keep their humanity, and fight back against the oppression of the enslaving financial oligarchy. But then every chapter was also chock full of economic analysis, and you see that everything driving the decisions that were made in the American South, and it was class struggle that eventually led and drove people to the Civil War. You had the Northern capitalists who were drawn into a conflict with the Southern enslavers. Obviously, once that struggle broke out, the slaves knew who they were going to side with. And then, as we were talking about earlier, you had a lot of white wage laborers, who were also in really destitute conditions. So, all of these different classes led to a struggle culminating in a war, which changed the mode of production. So if we stick to this historical materialist method and continually go from the abstract to the concrete, I think we can get a better understanding of things like racism, its historical legacy in this country, and its connection to the various modes of production.
Absolutely. And I wanted to switch gears towards a series of concepts that he uses. I didn't say Siri. I don't know why Siri's acting up.
Wow, you're a socialist with an iPhone.
Right.
So can I tell a very funny story about my son real quick and see?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, or no, it's about Alexa. I always get those two mixed up. So I got my parents an Alexa a few years ago, right? And my mom loves it. To this day, loves that thing. My dad felt like he was in Star Trek. It was wonderful, which is like a thing between him and me in Star Trek. But anyway, I have a son who's 12 now and is going to be 13 very soon. But when he was around 9, he discovered their Alexa, right? And decided that he would set that it. Well, he found out that it could set alarms and reminders. So every single day he went over there, he would set a reminder for like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. to fart. right? So it will wake my parents up, like Alexa going, "This is your 3 a.m. reminder to fart." And my son loved that. The image of it waking them up. And my father, it was one of my father's favorite memories of things he did. Anyway, go on.
That's wonderful. I wanted to switch gears towards three concepts that he uses that all relate to ideology. He talks about ideological conceptions in order to describe the inverted reflex that jurists and philosophers and intellectuals in general have in their analysis. And in another place, he speaks about false consciousness. And I think all of these three are connected as concepts that set the ground for ideology critique of ideology. But it's interesting, there's this debate within Marxism of what is ideology, right? So we can, one side says that ideology is just the realm of ideas that exists in the superstructure. There's always ideology. And then Engels here doesn't seem to hold on to that view. When he speaks about ideological conceptions, he's very specifically talking about the people that see things backwards, that see like the laws that the jurists develop as coming from a void, as coming from as coming a priori without any previous experience. So he says here, the jurist imagines that he is operating with a priori propositions, while the latter are, after all, only reflections of the economic process. Laws are just reflections of the economic process. And so everything remains standing on its head, right? This image is very popular. They use it to describe their relationship to Hegel. The inverted reflex, so long as it is not recognized for what it is, constitutes what we call ideological conceptions. That is able to exert a reactive influence on the economic base and within certain limits to modify it, seems to be self-evident. So there's a way I think we mentioned it quite a few times the last stream Eddie and I did, about the way that the bourgeoisie sees the world as almost upside down. And this is what he's getting at, right? When you're looking at ideas as the source of things in the world, you're looking at the world upside down, because what grounds ideas? It's the social practices that are specific to a mode of production. And yes, those ideas develop their own independence and then can influence that mode of production, condition it, but it's always grounded on the mode of production and the social. Like, you can't develop the idea of scientific socialism in ancient Greece. You couldn't develop the idea, regardless of how smart, of how brilliant and how well-intentioned the utopian socialists were. Robert Owens, Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, they couldn't develop scientific socialism. Why? Because the material conditions were not ripe to give rise to the emergence of the ideas in order to understand these material conditions concretely. And this is something that unfortunately know that the philosopher Vasyulin from the Soviet Union, he comes from the school of Lomonosov in the 60s. He's in the tradition of creative Marxism. He says something very important, which unfortunately the books are not translated to English, but what I've been able to read from secondary sources, he says that the method of going from the abstract to the concrete can only be applied to matured totalities. You can't have the analysis that Marx does, where volume 1 is on production, volume 2 circulation, volume 3 on the capitalist production as a whole, which is a series of concretization of the analysis of capitalist production as a whole. You can't have that until capitalist production as a whole develops and matures and shows, and it gives to you its essential characteristics. So I think this is something that is important. And the image that I've used before, I'd included in the book that's coming out towards the end of the month, is that of a video game character. That's like, since you haven't hit a specific stage, you can kind of see the character, but it's black, it's locked, you can't use it. The dialectical materialist method, in order to really fully use it and give a concrete and comprehensive picture of totalities, those totalities itself need to be developed. Adam Smith, regardless of his brilliance, couldn't develop scientific socialism or a proper concrete understanding of capitalism. Neither could the other utopian socialists. It had to wait till Marx, not because he was special, even though he was a genius, right? But because of the conditions that had developed at that time. And the same thing with Hegel, right? Hegel had no opportunity in Germany to see the development of capitalism. He saw some of the embryos of it and criticized what he saw, but it takes time for things to develop materially. And then once they develop, they give rise to the potential for them to be understood ideologically or at the level of ideas.
I think the way we think about ideology within Marxism kind of shows you how like surface level and childish the way it's used in common parlance is, right? People use the word ideology as if it's like a set of utopianism that we choose, right? They say, well, what's your ideology? I'm a libertarian. I'm an anarchist. I am a council communist, Luxembourgist, anarcho, syndicalo, whateverist, right? There's a million isms and asms. But the more the actual view, what ideology actually is not of conscious thought. When Engels is talking here about things being ideological, he's talking about a sort of, not a false consciousness, but a lack of consciousness, right? Sort of like the jurists who don't understand that there is a deeper thing as they create laws according to that deeper thing.
I want to make a comment. Somebody here says that's true. Even Ricardo developed what David Harvey calls Ricardian socialism, solving inequality through distribution instead of tackling the relations of production. And yeah, I'm kind of an economics nerd because after studying it at the academic level a little bit, and then, you know, everyone becomes a bit of an economics nerd after reading Capital. But, you know, classical economics, meaning like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, that was an actual attempt to understand capitalism, an actual attempt to make a scientific analysis of the system. And Carlos was talking earlier about Marx and Engels recognizing the importance of studying economics because capitalism had developed into a totality, you know, and the analysis needed to be extended further. But if you compare classical economics, which Marx, you know, brought to not a definitive conclusion, but really summed up a lot of the problems with and created an economic science that we know as Marxian economics. Classical economics was much more scientific versus bourgeois economics today, which is what we call neoclassical economics, which is basically just studying how to maximize capital for a capitalist by moving wealth around. And if you're studying the system on a macro level at all, you're just studying how to maintain it, you know, how to keep the system going using the Fed by adjusting interest rates like they recently did. So it's not a science or a field of study that's allowed to criticize capitalism or even recognize class struggle, which is at the core of capitalism. They just try and keep things like GDP really high. So yeah, there's more value in old school classical economists, I guess.
And Marx recognizes that.
He does. And he uses them so much in the footnotes.
Right. And in the first preface to the first German edition of Capital, he explicitly says that it gets to a point that bourgeois science, bourgeois economists can no longer get anything near to a scientific analysis of political economy because of their class bias, because they're not analyzing things from the basis of class struggle. And as you said, Eddie, you cannot have a scientific understanding of the existing order if your whole function is figuring out how to perpetuate it and how to do all these different schemes to keep the existing order up. And so in that sense, there's the recognition that, you know, truth is revolutionary, right? Truth, we don't understand it as something completely absolute. It's something that's historical and it develops, and it's both relative and not relative at the same time. But truth is tied to the history of struggle. And in order to attain a true understanding of the existing order of things, you need to be on the side of the proletariat. You need to be on the side of the working class. There's no way around it, right? And I think that the comments you made about what economics quote unquote science has been reduced to after Marx. I think it hits the nail on the head.
So one of the greatest of American heroes, William Z. Foster, in History of the Three Internationals, he talks about this, and he says that bourgeois economists in our era have become nothing but apologists for the current system. Right. And he goes on to say, historical materialism, the method of Marx, with its stress on the economic factor, gives to Marxists a decisive advantage in drawing the elementary lessons of all past society. And he does this in reference to the economic system and puts it in contrast with how the original bourgeois economists were striving to understand society and affect it positively. And it then became a game of halting societal growth, halting it as society progressed and matured and developed, or bourgeois society, that is.
Radhika Desai says that neoclassical economics has no concept of history at all, which I think is a good way to explain it and understand it, especially because we're talking about historical materialism today and the importance of seeing everything in their interconnection. Neoclassical will just isolate markets, and be like, let's look at the supply and demand and look at nothing that's connected to it. So they have no conception of history, versus the classical economics or economists like Smith and Ricardo would engage with history and how capitalism came about.
Buster actually talks about that in 3 paragraphs away from that quote. And he says that the bourgeoisie have an almost arbitrary system of history writing.
Right.
Pretty good.
And I
talk about that too.
I wanted to maybe flesh out this idea that he talks about as false consciousness or ideological conceptions, and think about their objective grounding, right? Because it's very easy to, when you hear ideological conceptions, immediately reduce it, as people do with commodity fetishism, to an individualized experience. And that's not the case. It's not specifically a problem of, just the way that an individual looks at the world. It's the objective conditions which determine how it is that these people look at the world and the outlooks that they develop. And so I think that the way that we should be looking at things like ideological conceptions and false consciousness is that they're false, but they play an essential role in the truth of the system, right? In order for the system to function, it needs to consistently develop objectively in its development these this form of false consciousness, this form of inverted reflexes, this form of ideological conceptions. And it's objective, like it's in institutions. It's you go into these institutions, and these are the ideas that are there, right? Ideas are never just floating around in the ether. They're embodied in people and in the institutions those people create. So there's an objective ground for these for this false consciousness, and it plays a necessary role in the existing order.
And this is why Lenin tells us to avoid economism or trade union opportunism and wage the ideological struggle, right? Because it does have an importance. And we do, of course, we base our strategy on trying to organize workers because of their relation to the means of production. But we still need to, meet them where they're at ideologically and wage that ideological struggle, as well as organizing them into say a union or some organ of working class power. And obviously our goal then, and what we want to educate them on, is based in production. We want to eventually change the mode of production, move it forward. But in order to do that, we have to wage the ideological struggle, because it's connected, and the ideology does have an objective presence and effect in the world.
The ideological struggle. Oh, I'm sorry, Eddie.
No, you're good. I was done.
Okay. The ideological struggle in our era of rapid information sharing and rampant faux radicalism coming from the bourgeois institutions like the academy and the media could not be more important, or what Gramsci would call the war of position, right? to find the correct position and then extrapolate out and create a genuine counter hegemony to the bourgeois one, rather than the sort of controlled faux opposition and faux counter hegemony that they give us. The 1619 project that you mentioned earlier is a perfect example of this, right? It bills itself or brands itself as counter-establishment and against the ruling ideology, but it is 100% within that ruling ideology and acts as a bulwark against genuine class consciousness, right? Like what Marx and Engels actually talk about as class consciousness, creating a false consciousness. And also, part B of what I was going to say is that it's not just going to where people are, right? That's what Eddie said the economism part is. It's going to where people are and then bringing them forward, developing what is there to be developed. So we don't just go to, the workers in my workplace, right? I didn't just go to them and say, I agree with you guys. Your notions of like freedom and loving your community and all that, that's awesome. What I do is I go to them and say, all that stuff is awesome, and here's what we do with it, right? Here's what's actually happening when we think about this and carry these thoughts through, and here's how we actually make that concrete. We take it from the level of us just bullshitting here, on the job, wasting time and stealing hours off the clock, and we make it into something real in worker power, right? And communism.
Yes, absolutely. And I wanted to switch into something that might take me a little bit to develop. So if anyone has immediate comments about what you just said, Eddie, did you have?
I was just gonna say people have brought up Gramsci a handful of times as we're talking about ideology and a Marxist analysis of culture, and I think Gramsci did do a good job of making ideological and cultural analyses based in class or based in the dialectical materialist method or historical materialist method. And then the Frankfurt School, who, sort of pretends to base themselves on Gramsci, who then unfortunately Gramsci gets lumped in with a lot,
Right.
kind of take his analysis and then divorce culture and ideology from class. And as Gabriel Rockhill points out, most of these Frankfurt School thinkers were against any real, class struggle or activism that was going on at the time. They just wanted to sit in the academy and use Marxism to analyze culture. So, I just wanted to point that out about Gramsci.
It goes back to the point of all of the letters, just real quick, that it's not one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's one creates and shapes the other, which creates and shapes that. And they go onward and upward in spirals going around and around.
Right. And that's a really good segue into what I wanted to bring up, a tweet from Wednesday. Are you guys seeing this?
Yep.
So this guy, Hegel and Marx were trending on Wednesday, and this guy said Hegel and Marx were not wrong. History has overall tended towards progress. And no offense to this guy, I don't know who he is. I don't mean to be shitty on him, but
sorry, Lay.
History has overall tended towards progress, to ever greater expansion of degrees of freedom for humans, but not due to some natural law of society, rather due to conscious struggle. And you see what he's doing here. He is separating natural law, which stands for the pole of determination, to conscious struggle, which stands for the pole of freedom. And what we retweeted was the separation of conscious struggle from objective factors that arise out of history is a false dichotomy. Freedom is the knowledge of necessity. Conscious struggle of the masses is not separated from the objective development of history. This is the cunning of reason. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that concept of the cunning of reason, because it appears in Engels's work, and it's an idea that comes from Hegel. So I wanted to pull up real quick here Hegel's philosophy of history, which is the text of Hegel's that Lenin liked the least, but it's still, I believe, a masterpiece. Here we go. The special interest of passion is thus inseparable from the active development of a general principle, for it is from the special and determinate form of its negation that the universal results. Particularity contends with its like, and some loss is involved in the issue. It is not the general idea that is implicated in opposition and combat, and that is exposed to danger. It remains in the background, untouched, uninjured. This may be called the cunning of reason, that it sets the passions to work for itself, while that which develops its existence through such impulsion pays the penalty and suffers loss. So, what does this mean? This is very obviously jargony. It's Hegel speaking, but what Hegel's idea of the cunning of reason really means is that reason unfolds through history, and it is a lawful unfolding. It is determinate. It's not something that is just it's arbitrary. There's determination behind it in law, but it's also connected to human passion, human desires, and human freedom and the conscious struggle, because history shapes the conditions of those humans, which then end up taking up the necessary ideas, the necessary struggles, the necessary formations, which advance the interest of history. So their historical determination is completely tied to human freedom, right? And in fact, we can even go farther and say that real human freedom is when we involve ourselves in a collective project to advance history. And that is both historically determined, as in history sets the conditions for human to do that, but is also the most expressive form of human agency. Human freedom done through grasping necessity and taking necessity forward. And I wanted to just read real quick from one of the letters, I believe it's the second letter from Engels. He says, history is so made that the end result always arises out of the conflict of many individual wills, in which every will is itself a product of a host of special conditions of life. So again, wills are a result of other conditions. It's not that there is no will or that there's just pure will. It's a result of determinations. Consequently, there exist innumerable intersecting forces, an infinite group of parallelograms of forces which give rise to one resultant product, the historical event. This again may itself be viewed as the product of a force acting as a whole without consciousness or volition. For what every individual wills is separately is frustrated by what everyone else wills, and the general upshot is something which no one willed. And so the course of history has run along like a natural process. It also is subject essentially to the same laws of motion. Again, this idea that Western Marxism purports that, nature is over there, it's got no dialectic, it's separate from human history because only humans have agency and only there does the dialectic apply. They're doing the same mistake that, this mistake that arises from what Hegel calls the understanding, this bifurcation of two things, they're separate. And they're the ones that claim that Soviet Marxism and the tradition of Marxism-Leninism, which embraces Engels and which doesn't say, oh, he was just a corrupter of Marx, they're the ones that say they're the mechanistic ones and the ones that are undialectical. But it is the Western Marxists, the ones that purport and proliferate these unnecessary bifurcations and divisions. Engels continues, and so the course of history has run like a natural process. It is also subject essentially to the same laws of motion, but from the fact that the wills of individuals who desire with the constitution of their body as well as external circumstances, in the last instance, economic, either personal or social, impel them to desire, do not get what they wish, but fuse into an average or common resultant from all that one has no right to conclude that they equal zero. On the contrary, every will contributes to the resultant and is insofar included within it. So I think this gets at the essence that it's not either or. There's no either or anywhere. It's both a unity of human wills collectively acting, and that collective willful free activity is itself determined by history.
I also like that he points out that individualism is a form of sort of obfuscation of what's actually happening, right? That the collective will of society, or not collective will, the collective of society in motion is more than the sum of the individual wills. It's all of these individual wills interacting, right? And the class struggle and alienation of society in general plays the determining role in how this looks. It develops all of these wills to then do this. And it goes back to this bit that Hegel wrote about the cunning of reason, right? Where he says this specifically in an individual circumstance, if I'm getting that correctly. I don't know. I asked Carlos all my Hegel questions, so I hope that's right.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the father of Russian Marxism, Georgy Plekhanov, he's got what I think is his best work ever. We were talking about it earlier, Noah, which is the article he writes on the 60th anniversary of Hegel's death. And one of the things that he notices after a close reading of Hegel's philosophy of history is that Hegel is forced, because of this, right? Because he's cognizant of the fact that idea, or the ideas that people have, the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist, is not this abstract thing that's divorced from human history. No, it's a product of history. Because he's aware of that, because he's aware of the sociality of human thinking, he is forced at times to postulate developments in the mode of production and how those ended up conditioning the culture which arose and allowed spirit to develop. So one of the interesting things that Plekhanov notices, as I think you were hinting at, Noah, is that Hegel, because he has this method, even though it's in an embryonic form, as we mentioned, capitalism wasn't as developed then, he is able to start beginning to see that there's a material ground for these developments in culture, and that material ground is in the relations that people engage in order to produce objectively the conditions which allow the cultural life of civil society to even take place in the first place.
Like, think about what you just said. Like, that is absolutely one of the most insightful things in human history. Like, that is like a key solution to how everything happens. And I always contrast this to faux radicalism that happens so much these days. That is like it, rather than like these like general like conceptions leftists have of Marxism, like how much deeper is that, right? Than, like it's the moral sort of framing of how society is supposed to work. That, the individual will, by the way, the individual, not to ramble, but the individual will was sort of a Hitler thing. If you remember, right. It came out of Nietzsche, but like it was, his whole thing was the triumph of the will, right? And that's what he called Nazi Germany, was the triumph of the will and individualism put into a collective situation. So I don't know, it strikes me as like how much deeper this thought is, right, than the surface level we see all the time, and how like just diametrically opposed Marxism and then Nazism are, obviously, but how close is liberalism? How easy is that to go into Nazism or another form of fascism? Because it's the same sort of processes and way of looking at it, rather than this deeper Marxist view that comes out of the best and most amazing, legendary, historical insights that humanity has ever come to. And it's crazy to me to read that, and I just get like really humbled that I get to learn these things from Hegel and Marx and Engels, of all people, Right,
absolutely. Any other comments? Is there any other topic that stood out to any of you from the letters that we have yet to hammer out?
I think Paul had a good one.
What was it?
The race.
Yeah, right. Like Engels says something about how race is an economic factor, and he doesn't really elaborate on it. I don't think.
Not here.
I think yeah.
I think he says exactly. He says race itself is an economic factor.
Yeah.
The book you linked earlier, Frank Chapman's, what is it, like Marxist-Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism.
Yeah.
It goes into this. and talks about the particularity of the American struggle against racism, which is different than any other civilization, right? As American civilization has become itself, race and racism have played a very important factor in pushing forward our progress. It was determined by class and the economic factor, but then this in turn affects the economic factor, right? Exactly what Engels was talking about. And Chapman looks at it through the Marxist lens. The Black liberation struggle is a form of class struggle. And Du Bois writes about that too. Winston writes about that. One of our favorite thinkers around now, Anthony Montero, talks about this every weekend at his Saturday free school, right? Which I promise I'm going to get to one of these days.
And also Lasordo, I think. You've written articles on Lasordo's book on the class struggle, but the way that he understands class struggles in plural and how these different things that today we just label identity things, how they in different circumstances come to the fore as the form of class struggle.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's been a while since I read the book, but he basically has this genus species model of class struggle where you have different kinds of class struggle. I mean, he focuses on like a sample of 4 or 3 or 4. Like you have like traditional class struggle that Marx and Engels talks about like the class struggle in the metropole. Then he talks about national oppressions. Basically, you have one nation exploiting another nation by extracting surplus value from it. And then he talks about like the oppression of women, right? How women were basically, for at least until recently, they were confined to domestic labor, right? They couldn't really sell their labor power or whatever, at least in the early days of capitalism. So they had to produce some kind of, I guess, something like some kind of surplus value for the patriarch or for the family. And yeah, he just talks about different forms of class struggle, but he just talks about those 3. But one can imagine that you could talk about more, right? So like, I mean, I don't know, like one example could be like disabilities, right? Like, I don't know, like one can imagine that in before the higher stage of communism, like everyone has to use their labor power to work, and some people just due to circumstances they can't really exercise their labor power the same way, right? So through Lucerdo's model, but it's not really Lucerdo's model. It's really based on varieties of Marx and Engels. You can understand a variety of different struggles. You can understand struggles of people who are disabled, people who are, LGBTQ, et cetera, right? You can understand it through this lens, right? This framework that Lucerdo articulate. And I think that what I'm passionate about is that I think Marxists should sort of develop this framework, right, a bit further, because we need to combat the faux counter hegemony left. The faux counter hegemony left is actually counter-revolutionary. They work for the ruling class. They defend the ruling class. And this is where false consciousness comes in. They think they're opposing it, right? That's the conscious part. But there are unconscious social forces at work propelling them to defend this social order, especially when the social order is experiencing some kind of delegitimization, right? People are fed up with, whether they're aware of it or not, they're fed up with capitalism, right? People of all strands are fed up with it, right? It's not capitalism isn't working for them, right? I mean, it hasn't been working for them. They're experiencing the oppression, right, of capitalism, and they're getting fed up with it, and now you have this full counter hegemony. And I think what Marxists should do is we need to update, right? We need to further develop Marxism to combat the faux counter hegemony left, and not only counter them but surpass them, right? And have a monopoly on on what's the right tool for the proletariat, right? Because I think there's a competition going on within so-called leftists. We're all competing with one another, telling basically advertising what's the correct instrument for combating the establishment, right? People have different answers, but I guess in the sense we're more traditional, we think no, it's Marxism. It's always been Marxism because if you look at history, who utilized Marxism? The colonized nations, right? China, Vietnam, Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of these nations, they used it, right? And and I don't think it's any coincidence that since then, like the bourgeoisie developed something like post-colonial studies to delegitimize Marxism, to say Marxism, oh, Marx is a colonizer, or Marx talks like a colonizer. They want to delegitimize Marxism in order to advance a counter, a fake counter hegemony, right? It reminds me of the first sentence that Lenin wrote in the same revolution. I forgot what he said exactly, but he said something about how they deprive Marxism, right, of its revolutionary edge. They blunt the revolutionary edge of Marxism. They hollow out the revolutionary figures, right? All these revolutionary figures, they hollow them out and they turn them into liberals, right? MLK, liberal. Malcolm X, liberal. Huey Newton, liberal. They liberalize them. They defang them, right? And they're no longer weapons for the proletariat, but weapons for the bourgeoisie, right? And as Marxists, we need to engage in a consistent, staunch ideological struggle against that, right? Not only do we need to take back these figures, but we can only do it by advancing Marxism, by advancing it as a superior weapon, right, for the proletariat, as the uncontesting, undisputable weapon for the proletariat. And anyone who says otherwise, I'm sorry, there are enemies. There are enemies. I'm sorry, there are enemies. That's how I see it. There are enemies, and ideological enemies to be specific. And we need to prove them wrong. Sorry, I'm done with my rant.
No, that was a wonderful rant, brother. Don't worry about it. I loved. I just want to say this one quick thing. ID poll, liberal ID poll, identity politics. This is a contentious issue for the left, right? And when we as Marxists look at it, we sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Castigate identity politics as bourgeois and anti-worker, etc. But at the same time, we have to remember that most of the people we're talking to are thinking ideologically. They're not thinking about it on our level. So a lot of the people, when you say identity politics serves the ruling class, what they're interpreting that as is you hate black people, you hate women, etc., etc. So what we need to do is say, well, actually, this liberal identity politics doesn't really accomplish the job it says to. It accomplishes the opposite. You know what does? Marxism does, right? Marxism has explained these things in a superior manner for longer. And the only reason these things have developed is precisely what Paul said, to shift the focus away from communism. I mean, all this stuff is done very, very concretely and very purposefully. The entire faux left was created to keep people away from communism. We have to keep saying that over and over and over again until everybody hears it, because it's true. What people grew up with thinking was left in our era, even in my generation, especially in your generation, is anti-communist. It's anti-worker. It's anti-humanity itself. When you think about workers and the proletariat as the nascent force in society, right? So combating that is precisely what we need to do, which is why I loved your rant, Paul.
Thank you.
I think people who watched my content from the beginning too have probably seen that shift as I've become more familiar with, more familiar with Marxism, but also more
Oh.
familiar with the political situation in the U.S. I don't know how long I've been studying Marxism now, like 3 years or so. But it becomes more obvious the more, acquainted you become with Marxism, and then the more you look at the modern left, that there are glaring problems and that and that the most of the left is extremely anti-communist, anti-worker, and pessimistic. So yeah, it's worth combating. And I know people sometimes get mad, like you guys spend as much time criticizing leftists as you do right wingers. But for one, we criticize right wingers a lot, and two, it's extremely important. And Marx and Lenin especially Lenin spent a ton of time criticizing other Marxists and other leftists, because it's important.
Let me just say, Eddie, in 3 years, seeing how much you've learned and developed. I mean, I didn't watch at the beginning, but I wish I had learned that much when I was 3 years in. Right? Like, I'm consistently inspired by you and other young people these days. That it's amazing to me. When I was your age, man, like, you would have hated me. I was the worst. And like people tried to teach me this stuff, my father, etc. Like, I wanted nothing to do with it. I knew everything already, and like I was a complete asshole. So like it's amazing when I'm watching this sort of thing, and it makes me keep going, right? And that's saying something, because I'm old and tired and very jaded.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear it. Got a lot of good influences.
Yes, you do.
I'm trying to pull up the sign you made. That's the new motto.
We have a new Midwestern Marx slogan, everyone.
Yes.
If Carlos can find it. And
Got it.
you think I'm joking? We're for real about this. There's gonna be T-shirts.
Is it up?
It's loading.
There we go.
It is.
Don't be an asshole.
Oh,
DBAA. Get it on bracelets. Look at it whenever someone annoys you. Don't be an asshole. But yeah, I think we had a lot of fruitful discussion. Do we want to maybe give comments to close out? We're nearing the 1.5 hour mark. Just like I wanted to remind the folks that if you have any suggestions for other texts that we should cover, please let us know in the comments. Specifically for those live, if you can do so in the comments of the actual video when YouTube clears it, so that it's open and in the front. Please do so, because we're jotting down the suggestions that we have seen so far. I think that Eddie and I were talking earlier about using the manual, the old CPUSA manual, the 30s manual for the next one.
I love that
really
idea.
want to do that.
That's fantastic.
I love that thing.
We currently have a list for the next maybe like 40 Cadre schools. But please throw suggestions, and if it overlaps with some of the stuff we have written down, we'll bump it up. Or do it.
I missed the one suggestion where somebody earlier said we should all read Bookchin. Let's not do that. I've read Bookchin, by the way, and the guy's an idiot.
Sucks.
Write down the name, and we'll make sure that he gets gulag time after the revolution.
Bookchin one time mocked Parenti for caring so much about all the starving little children in the Soviet Union who they fed.
What?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Bookchin's a complete reactionary piece of shit.
Jeez.
Okay, so any closing comments, folks?
Just one. Don't be an asshole.
There you go.
Definitely. No, I enjoyed this. This was a great discussion, a great read. So thanks to Paul and Noah and Carlos, as always, for being here. And thanks to everyone in the audience, too. We hope you enjoyed it.
Paul, any last comments?
I'm tired.
Right,
The
these
red
late
took it out
streams
of
are
him.
difficult.
Yeah.
It's mostly the best time to catch people, but they're difficult on folks that have come from work like most of us. But all right, folks, thank you to everyone who watched this. We'll catch you probably next week. I wanted to give a heads up that on Thursday around the same time we're going to be doing a stream with Alan Freeman and potentially Radhika Desai, and we're going to be talking about Marxist crisis theory and how the current discourse about financialization, which tries to just see the root causes of crisis and finance and speculation, how what that's really grounded on is the general tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and how Marx's depiction of this tendency in Capital is right and the best way for understanding the crisis of capital, which I believe in the U.S. we have a one that's forthcoming within the next year or two. That's going to just proliferate and make even worse the other sort of social crisis or social ills that we're experiencing right now. So look out for that next week. And then on Saturday, we're going to be talking to Ramiro Sebastian Funes about Edward Bernays, the father of modern propaganda, what in school they whitewashed by calling it public relations. So we hope to see some cool clips, have an interesting discussion then. So see you all, and I hope you all have a great night.
Bye, everybody.